Chapter 2. "Tareq!" I exclaimed more shrilly than I intended. I quickly modified my tone to one of disgust. "Have you been standing here spying on me all this time?" "I have," he admitted, unabashed. "I looked for you last night, but couldn't find you, and again this morning. But no one had any idea where you'd gone. I followed my suspicions and the trail you didn't bother to cover, and both led me here." He looked around. "This place is a mess, isn't it?" he asked. I frowned, still annoyed at my carelessness. The fists didn't tidy up after themselves, no. "If you don't like it, feel free to leave." He didn't take the hint. "Why are you here, anyway?" he asked. "It had better be important. Rhydian doesn't want us creeping around Red Rock, and I don't think he'll continue this new habit of letting you slide past his rules. He says the Praetor's men will be watching this place." "Rhydian says a great many things," I said, "but sometimes I need to follow my own promptings." Tareq looked closely at me. "That doesn't sound like you. You've always been quick to jump at his every whim, the first to defend each word from his mouth. Don't tell me you're finally giving up your misguided loyalties." "My misguided loyalties are none of your business," I said. "I'm just beginning to think a few things out for myself, that's all. And you can wipe that smirk from your face, because I'm not about to concede you were ever right." "I'm not smiling." "Oh yes, I forgot. You're too good to gloat," I said. "Well, never mind. You've found me, and now you can leave me alone. I've decided to go away for a bit to stay with I hesitated to call Hadrian a friend. "An acquaintance in Selbius. I'll be gone for a while, and I don't want you trailing after me." "I've no intention of trailing after anybody." He sounded affronted and slightly hurt. "Aren't you even curious why I've been looking for you?" "Not especially." "I'm leaving too," he said. "I wanted to tell you farewell." I hid my surprise. "Yes, well, save your tender goodbyes until you've spoken with Rhydian. I've a hunch he's not about to let you go anywhere, and we both know you'll never set foot beyond Dimming without his permission." "Really?" Tareq folded his arms stubbornly. "Care to lay any wagers on that?" "Since when does the pure-hearted priest boy take bets?" I teased, amused, despite myself. "You know, you're getting to be quite the rebel these days. One moment you're wagering, the next you're contemplating breaking your oath to Rhydian. What would good old honored Thilstain say about all this?" He looked a little guilty, but didn't back down. "Never mind my oath," he said. "Brig's death has made me rethink a lot of things, including my situation here. I've decided to find my way to Whitestone Abbey and the priesthood intended for me. These past few years haven't changed my destiny, merely delayed it." "Well," I said shortly, "I hope you find peace at your abbey, slaving over translations and prayers with your broken vow hanging over your head. For myself, I have my own plans, and it's time I put them into action. Farewell, Tareq." He said, "You sound disappointed in me, Elon. What makes you so concerned with whether I keep my word to Rhydian? You yourself once told me honesty meant nothing to thieves and cutthroats." "Never mind, forget it," I said, unable to explain even to myself why I disapproved. Maybe it was merely his hypocrisy that irked me. Then, too, he was also holding up my progress. I moved to slip around him, but he intercepted me, grabbing my arm. "I don't break my oath lightly," he said. "I'm running as far from Dimming as I can get, but not for the reasons you think. The truth is, I'm afraid. Does that surprise you? Probably not. You've always thought me a coward anyway, and have never been slow to say so." His tone turned bitter. "Well, maybe I'm not as brave as Rhydian's loyal hound, but it's not my life I'm concerned about. Not this time." "You want to know what I'm running from? Well, here it is, and you can laugh at me if you like." Despite his defiant tone, he was suddenly looking everywhere but at me. "This life. This world you've brought me into? It's changing me, and not for the better. I don't know what I'll become if I stay here. I've always valued truth and justice, you know that. I'm no honored one, and maybe I'm not fit to be one. But I've still got to hold on to a bit of myself, don't I? I don't want to wake up one morning to find myself no different from the rest of you. I thought he flattered himself with such a concern, and was about to say so, when his fingers tightened around my arm, reminding me he wasn't the weak boy he had been last spring. He seemed unaware his grip was cutting into me as he said, "What happened the other night? At the woods holding? You remember how I found you?" I nodded reluctantly. It wasn't a scene I cared to think about. "I saw you kill that man Rhydian," he continued. "I watched from the shadows while the two of you struggled. It wasn't fear that held me back from aiding you. I was unwilling to involve myself in the violence. You understand?" I did. Tareq had always deplored fighting. "So I hung back," he resumed. "But suddenly, I saw that man nearly knock you over. I knew he was going to kill you right there, and I felt fear. A tide of fear and anger like I've never known before. I was ready to join you then, although I had nothing to fight with but my bare hands. If I was too late to save you, well, at least I thought I'd find a way to avenge you." The only part of his story I found particularly shocking was that he cared enough to avenge me, but I kept the thought to myself. I could see he needed somebody to hear him out. He went on. "I was about to rush in when, suddenly, you recovered, slashed his throat, and as quick as that it was all done. The fight was over, and I hadn't even moved." His gaze lost its intensity, but he still appeared unable to look at me. I cannot tell you how horrified I was when I realized what I had been prepared to do. I would have murdered that man, or died trying. So that was it. I shifted uncomfortably, pointing out, "It wouldn't technically have been murder. Rhydian was a traitor who deserved to die. A traitor to you, maybe, and to your red hand, but so far as the law was concerned, he was assisting in apprehending dangerous criminals. So were those other men, the fists I nearly burned alive in the hold house." I didn't much care for this turn in the conversation. "You can hate yourself over those fists if you want," I said roughly. "I don't know how to keep you from it, but I forbid you to pity Rhydian. The scum betrayed Brigg to his death and tried to kill me. Your only thought was to protect a friend, or to avenge one, as the case may have been. Both were worthy intentions. Worthy for mindless animals like Rhydian and the rest of you, maybe," he said, "but not for me." Now he was beginning to sound like himself. "Oh, dust off your gray robes, priest boy," I said. "You didn't kill Rhydian. I did. So feel free to go off to your abbey with a mostly light conscience, and spend the rest of your life brooding over the dark deeds you contemplated but never actually committed." His expression cleared. "Then you agree I'm right to go?" I said dryly, "I agree that you'll keep me here debating the question until I do agree, so let's cut the discussion short. Go to your abbey. Go with the blessings of Rhydian, the band, and all the province." He smiled a little. "Now you're giving away more than you have the power to grant." "I'll give you the king's throne if you'll take yourself out of my way," I said, shrugging. "I've places to be." He looked glad to change the subject. "What exactly are your plans?" he asked. "Has it anything to do with this?" Before I could stop him, he darted a hand into my leather jerkin to snatch the bundle containing the brooch. "I saw you dig this out of your secret hiding place," he said smugly. "Give me that," I snapped, roughly attempting to wrench it back from him, but he withheld it from my reach. I said, "That parcel holds the brooch from my mother, and it's important to me. Return it, or I'll pound what little brains you have out your ears." Instead of complying, he tucked the parcel into his belt as if he intended it to stay there permanently. Tell me why it's so important you get it back, important enough to risk returning to this place, and I'll give it back to you. I glared. I told you. I'm leaving the forest, and don't know when I'll be back. I didn't want to leave behind anything of value. Except your outlaw friends, and me. Don't flatter yourself, I growled. He said, Look, what's the big secret? Why won't you tell me where you're going? I sighed and gave in. There was no need for secrecy, other than to annoy him, and that strategy was coming back to bite me. Walk with me as far as the Selbius Road, and I'll share a little of my plans, I said. But first, let's put this place behind us. I don't think Rhydian was wrong when he warned about the possibility of Fists keeping an eye on the area. Tareq agreed, and together we abandoned the dark reaches of the cave for the bright outdoor sunlight. We swept into an ambush. The surrounding clearing was occupied by over a dozen armed men, outfitted in the black and scarlet of the Praetor's Fists. All stood waiting, weapons drawn. Tareq and I froze. I had only seconds to take in our situation before a blurry object whizzed past my head, nearly nicking my ear. The Fist archer notched a second arrow to his bowstring, and Tareq, framed in the mouth of the cave, tried to shove me back inside. Didn't he realize we'd be trapped like mice in there? I planted my feet, resisting movement, as my mind raced to form a plan, any plan. The archer was prevented from losing the next arrow when a sudden command split the air. Hold! I want these mongrels taken alive for questioning. The order came from a broad-chested mountain of a man on horseback. Evidently the one in charge. He fixed a cold gaze on Tareq and me, and commanded the others to take us up. As the fists closed in, I cast my fear aside. Sliding my knives free of their wrist sheaths and pushing Tareq out of my way, I sent a blade flying to stick in the shoulder of the nearest fist. Then I broke into a run, grabbing Tareq's sleeve and hauling him along with me. Together, we darted for the nearest trees. Unfortunately, a handful of men stood between us and our escape. I dodged the first enemy, slipped a knife into the side of the second man moving to intercept me, but was less fortunate with the third, who caught my shoulder as I attempted to dart beneath his arm. Tareq came to my rescue, slamming into the fist and sending him reeling backward. My friend didn't stop there, but regained his balance and ran on, with me close behind. Neither of us slowed on reaching the shelter of the trees. I ran as if my heels had wings, and Tareq was faster still. A hail of arrows arced through the air, thudding into the ground around us. But the density of the forest worked in our favor, the thick trees shielding us and forcing our mounted enemies to rein in their horses and search for clearer paths. I had no idea where we were going. My breath soon came in ragged gasps, my heart thudding painfully against my ribs. The ground began to slope, lending momentum to my weary legs. I stumbled repeatedly as the incline grew steeper. A fallen log leapt in front of me, and hurdling it, I lost my footing, crashing and rolling downhill. Brambles and saplings whipped at me as I cartwheeled down before finally slamming into a thick tree trunk. The force of the collision knocked the breath from me, and the treetops swayed dizzyingly overhead as I tried to find the strength to rise. I heard sounds of approaching men and horses and, looking upward, saw our pursuers not far behind. Ignoring the hammering in my skull and the burning of my lungs, I crawled to my knees and staggered on, letting gravity pull me down the incline. When I neared the bottom, a fresh storm of arrows whistled by, embedding themselves in the surrounding trees. I skidded and stumbled on until the ground leveled out, and a tall stand of shrubs blocked me momentarily from the view of my enemies. There, as if on signal, my legs gave way, and I collapsed to the ground, where I lay panting, cheek pressed into the cool earth. In that condition, it took me a moment to notice the limp arm stretched across my field of vision. Tareq! He was stretched out, face down and motionless. The rise and fall of his shoulders showed he was breathing, but an arrow protruded from his back, and his tunic was stained scarlet. I had time to take in no more than that as I became aware of the sound of many feet crashing through the underbrush above. Urgency lent me the strength to drag Tarek's limp form into a tall stand of itch leaves and toad's breath. My bow fell from my shoulder, clattering to the ground, and I dragged it out of sight also before collapsing beside Tareq and letting the waving greenery close over us. I flattened myself to the ground, trying to quiet my noisy breathing as I heard the fists' arrival. They scattered to search for us, but I knew they wouldn't have to look long. I glanced at Tareq beside me. His eyes were closed, his face smeared with blood and dirt. Twigs and leaves stuck out of his hair. With his sun-browned skin and ragged clothing, nothing marked him apart from a common woods thief. No one would mistake him for a young priest in training anymore. Remembering how his strange, violet eyes had captivated me at our first meeting, I felt the urge to save him now as I had then, but this time I was as helpless as he. The crack of a stick underfoot betrayed an approaching fist. This is it, I thought. Time to face death. But there was no question of giving up without a fight. My hand fumbled for my bow. I had no arrows, but it was my only weapon, so I gripped it tightly, wondering at the calm washing over me the moment my fingers closed around the light wood. A whisper of movement passed through the air overhead. Unthinkingly, I threw myself to one side, narrowly avoiding the descending blade aimed at my head. I scrambled upright, swinging my bow out to whack my attacker across the knees. The fist only grinned at my ridiculous maneuver and swung his blade in what would have been a disemboweling sweep if I hadn't managed to avoid it. The sharp tip of the steel only licked the skin across my stomach, but I immediately felt the sting of the shallow cut. More enemies joined the fist, fanning out around me. I backed away, but was acutely aware every reluctant step carried me farther away from the injured Tareq. With my friend lying prone on the ground and me creeping backwards like a cornered rabbit, the fists evidently remembered that it was preferable to take me alive. They crowded in tighter, and I spun in a circle, impossibly attempting to keep my eyes on all of them, while brandishing my bow before me like a club. Some of my opponents laughed, and I realized how pathetic I must look. "Nice staff you have there, thief," said one of the fists, a short, bearded man with curly hair. "Now, why don't you just put it down and surrender?" His voice wasn't unfriendly, and he appeared to take it for granted I would do as he asked. When I didn't respond immediately, he asked, "Got any more knives up in your sleeve?" and took a measured step closer, as if testing my reaction. "Come on, Bane," one of his friends encouraged. "If she had any more, she'd have used 'em by now." Emboldened either by that observation or by my hesitation, the man called Bane moved nearer still. I darted a quick glance behind me, but there was nowhere left to run. Bane seemed to read my thoughts. "Don't even think about it," he said. "Our archers would drop you before you go 6 paces. But we don't want to do that, not unless you leave us no choice. You heard our captain. He wants you alive so he can ask a few questions." "I don't doubt he does," I said. "You caught several of my friends the other day, and I saw their condition when you were done questioning them." Another fist grinned. "So, you found the bodies, did you?" he asked. "We hoped you would. Think of it as a little present from all of us. That'll be the fate of every one of you thieving scum before we're through. The praetor has sworn to it." Bane waved him to silence and said to me, "If you saw what happened to your friends, You know some of my comrades can get overzealous in their work. You'd be wise to throw yourself on the mercy of our captain while you can. If you don't, I'm afraid you won't be all in one piece by the time he arrives." He nodded toward Tarek's motionless form. "Anyway, look how far running got your friend. It doesn't have to end the same way with you. The captain is a fair man, and he might let you off easily on account of your youth. So, why don't you lay down your weapons and come along with us? We'll take you straight to him, and the two of you can talk things over." I hesitated. You could never trust a fist, but what choice did I have? Even as this man spoke, he began sidling closer until he was only an arm's length away. Suddenly, he was reaching for me. In the same instant, my bow grew hot in my hands, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it as it flared to life, shedding a brilliant fiery light. Simultaneously, I felt its powerful presence awakening, not just in the bow itself, but somehow inside my mind. I shook my head against the disorienting sensation. Even as I saw the fist grabbing for me, and darted out of his way, another enemy took a swipe at me, and I narrowly evaded his sword. Bane shouted at the others to hold back, but he must have seen, as I did, that the game was over. He couldn't control his companions, and I wasn't about to stand there and let them kill me. I feinted to one side. The nearest enemy moved to intercept me, and I dodged the other direction, diving through the opening he had left. Free at last, I flew through the trees with renewed energy, hearing my enemies scrambling after me. They were mere steps behind. The nearest had only to stretch out a gauntleted hand to touch me. But Brigg used to say I was the fastest runner he ever saw, and I tapped into some new source of strength now. I had no idea from where it came. I only knew that the distance between the fists and me was widening. Remembering the archers, I ran in a zigzag pattern, putting as many trees between their bows and me as possible. My unnatural speed compensated for the lost ground, and the gap continued to grow. As soon as I was out of view, I dropped into a cluster of weeds, allowing my pursuers to pass by. Then I ran on in the opposite direction, never slowing. The scrape across my belly burned where the fist's blade had scored my skin, but the pain drove me on. Returning to the outlaw camp was impossible, not when it could lead the enemy to our door. Instead, I raced towards the setting sun, relieved when I began passing familiar landmarks. All of Dimming was home, but there were parts I knew better than others, and I was coming onto safer ground. The sun had sunk behind the trees, and the first stars were twinkling in the evening sky when I splashed into the shallow waters of Dancing Creek. I slogged downstream, following the pull of the swift current as it swirled and capriced over stones and around the fallen logs. The creek bed was slick with moss. Thousands of tiny pebbles shifted and skittered beneath my boots, and then the stream deepened, and I found myself wading through pools of murky green water up to my thighs. A little distance farther, and the creek shallowed at a section of rapids. The current was so strong here, it pulled me off my feet more than once. Always I scrambled up and hurried on. I was exhausted by the time I reached a place where the creek split into two smaller streams. I took the least obvious one and pushed on until I was waist-deep in a pool of stagnant water. I could go no farther. An immense tree grew along the bank, its spreading roots stretching out to skim the water. I ducked under the slimy surface, swam beneath the tangle of roots, and emerged within their embrace, pressing into the muddy bank to conceal myself. There was a sort of large animal den burrowing from the water's edge up beneath the tree, and, unslinging my bow, I shoved it into the tunnel and pulled myself up after. My feet were left dangling in the water. It was unnervingly dark, and I tried not to dwell on the possibility of the wild creature that lived in this den returning, or worse, of the fists finding me trapped and at their mercy. But even these fears couldn't hold my thoughts for long as, strength spent, I rested my cheek in the gritty mud and allowed my eyelids to droop. My last conscious action was to shove the unnerving bow as far from me as I could. It had stopped glowing, but I could still feel its presence in my head as I succumbed to sleep. Strange, soft murmurings of the thrill of battle and the sweetness of blood whispered through my dreams that night.